Hello guys, welcome back to another video here on the channel. What we're going to be looking at today are different sections in songs, and more specifically, good techniques to use when it comes to writing different sections in the songs to differentiate them from one another. Now there's a number of reasons why it would be a good thing to add some variety in the different sections in the songs that you write. And when I say sections, I mean like the A section, the B section, or in other words, the intro, verse, chorus, bridge, that sort of thing. What we're specifically going to look at today are techniques that I like to use in my different sections when I compose songs. There are also things that I notice when I analyze and look at other people's compositions that I've noticed are common trends to use as well. There's going to be a total of 6 different techniques that I'd like to look at and talk to you about today that I use and that I see used a lot in other compositions. And for each of these techniques, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give them a rating from 1 to 5, with 5 being a technique that I use a lot and I see used a lot with other composers, all the way to 1, techniques that are just as effective, if not more effective, but not as commonly used that I see or that I usually use myself. And in the end of this video, what I'm also going to do is we're going to look at a couple different sections of an original composition of mine, so you can hear examples of some of the techniques that I'll be talking about. But before we get started with all that, if you guys are new here to this channel, my name is Israel. And yes, like the country, I'm a musician and I am on a journey to become a professional composer, writing music with and for people. I'm here to document my journey for you guys, as well as share all the experiences and projects that I get involved in along the way. So now that that intro is out of the way, let's get into the first technique that I like to use when composing different sections for songs. So the first thing I'm going to talk about in changing to get to a different section of a song is changing the song's melody. The melody is arguably most of song's main feature. It's the part that's most noticeable, the part that you're left remembering the most. Things you can do to change the melody are having a melody that goes from having less rhythm to more rhythm, playing lower pitch notes to playing higher pitch notes, or maybe even pausing momentarily completely to let the other instruments fill in the space before it comes back in. And because the natural tendency is to pay so much attention to the melody anyway, not a whole lot has to change with it to let your listener know that you're going to a different section of your piece. So on a scale of 1 to 5, I'm going to give using the technique of changing melody a 5 on the rating. It's very common, it's very popular, and it's very noticeable and very effective if you want to use it. Okay, so the second technique we're going to talk about today is changing the feel of a composition from section to section, but more specifically, changing the rhythm to the feel. Kind of like the previous mentioned technique, melody, I'd say not a whole lot has to be changed to the rhythm to let your listener know that there's been a shift in the song. But what I'm more particularly talking about here is the rhythm of the percussive type instruments in a song, whether that be a drum set or simple hand percussion instruments. So when it comes to the percussion adding rhythm to a piece of music, certain elements of that percussion will usually play at certain parts of a measure throughout a piece, whether that be on beat 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or however many beats each measure has. 2 important things that the percussion does here is it establishes tempo and predictability rhythmically within a piece. Now, provided that the tempo, or BPM, beats per minute, stays the same within a piece, you can kind of get away with messing around and doing a lot with the percussive elements of a piece. For example, if a drum set's playing and like a lot of songs, the snare will hit on beats 2 and 4, you can create kind of a halftime feel by, instead of having the snare hit on beats 2 and 4, you have the snare just hit on beat 3 in each measure. Or if you have a simple hand percussion instrument like a clave, instead of playing quarter notes to drive the tempo of a song, you could have the clave change from quarter notes to eighth notes to give the illusion of speeding things up a bit. As long as you stay within the same tempo or BPM, there really are endless possibilities. And like changing the melody, it's going to be very obvious when you change one of these things, but the music will still be very put together and move along smoothly. So for my rating on a scale of 1 to 5 for this technique, I'm actually going to go ahead and give it a 4. I know it's a common thing that I typically hear in a lot of music that I listen to especially, but I have heard my fair share of pieces of music that have a pretty consistent beat, rhythm, and feel throughout the entire piece, which is totally fine. It just depends on what you're going for and the feel you're after. So the third strategy or technique I'm going to talk about today is changing the instrument or voice. This is a strategy that I think is less common with music that involves vocals, but more common in strictly instrumental music. And it is a strategy that's really a little change, but can have a big result. Let me explain for you. Say you have 2 sections of a song. where pretty much everything is the same within it. But the one single thing you change when moving to the second section is whatever voice or instrument is performing the melody, for example. This may not sound like a huge difference, but trust me, it creates a whole new experience for the listener. Let's take two instruments, for example, like a trumpet and a bass clarinet. A trumpet is an instrument that's very loud and bright. It kind of gets right in your face and lets you know it's there. A bass clarinet, on the other hand, is an instrument that, while it still has a lot of presence, isn't super bright and in your face like a trumpet is. It's better suited for playing lower tones and filling out the space within a piece. Now, even though a melody line could be kept completely the same, with these two instruments having the different qualities that distinguish them from one another, you get a totally different experience having one play the melody and then right after that, hearing the other play the melody. The texture, the timbre, and overall tone of the instrument is what's going to make the experience different from what you last heard in the previous instrument playing it. The same can be said for voices in music with vocals. A lot of male voices tend to have a certain kind of tone and feel to it. Female voices as well, even though they're a little different. Just having them swap roles in the next section of the song will give your listener an entirely different experience, just like the example with the trumpet and the bass clarinet. Something to note too, when I'm talking about changing the roles of instruments, I'm not strictly referring to just the melody. An instrument or voice that was previously performing the bass line or a section of the harmony could then switch to having the melody, or in the first section of a song, a string section could be performing the harmony. And then in the next, it could switch to a brass section. Two different sections of instruments that have totally different feels. I say this is an excellent strategy to use if between two sections you really don't want to change too much of it compositionally, but you still want to give your listener a different experience when they hear that next section, that is. On a scale of 1 to 5, I'm going to give this technique a 3, mostly because of what I said earlier. I hear it a lot in instrumental music, and I use that technique a lot in genres of music like pop, country, hip hop, and rock. If there's, say, a vocalist singing, that one single vocalist will probably hold the melody for most of the time and maybe not switch with like the bassist or something like that. Of course, you totally could do that for a section and that would definitely give your listener a different experience. I encourage you to experiment with things like that if you really feel up to it. The next technique I'm going to mention for you guys to possibly use in going from different sections into your songs is changing the chord progression. We talked earlier about changing the feel of a song from section to section with the rhythm, but when you change the chord progression of the song, you change the feel harmonically. Chords have a very wide variety of different qualities, stability, and tension within them depending on how they're structured. Chords that are major and are in triads typically have more stability than chords that are, say, minor and in sevenths or ninths. Whether you have 1, 2, 3, 4, or however many chords within a given progression before it repeats again, if you change the order of those chords or the quality of some of them, you're going to give your listener a different feel when you go from section to section. For the rating of this strategy, I'm going to give it a 5. I'd say that changing the chord progression from section to section within a composition is very common among pretty much all genres of music. Yes, there are some genres of music out there, or specific songs really, that have the same progression throughout, and that's totally cool too. I'll definitely have an example of this later in the video to show you guys so you can hear what it sounds like. Okay, so the next strategy I want to talk to you guys about is changing the key signature, or the key you're playing in the song. Now, even though I'd say this strategy is very effective, I'd say it's a little bit less common than the previous mentioned strategy in changing the chord progressions, though it is pretty relatable to it. It's relatable to the previous strategy of changing chord progressions because changing the key is related to changing the harmony of a piece of music. Again, just like rhythm gets you used to a certain tempo or groove of a piece of music, the key of a piece gets you used to certain notes and pitches within it and the overall harmony that gets created from them. Now, some keys will naturally sound brighter and some a little bit darker than others. If you're kind of wanting to shift the mood of your piece throughout it, this is a good strategy to use, I'd say. Typically, major keys are a little bit more brighter sounding than minor keys. So if you're wanting to shift the mood of a composition from something that sounds a little brighter and happier to something that sounds a little darker and moodier, I'd say shift from a major key to a minor key. Now, because I'd say this is a slightly less common strategy than the previous mentioned strategy of changing the chord progression, I'm going to rate it accordingly too. On a scale of 1 to 5, I'm going to give this one a 2. Now, a reason why I hear this used in songs a lot, but not quite as commonly, is because usually composers don't want to change the mood or feel of a song that much harmonically throughout it. You can change the feel harmonically within a song by changing the chord progression and still remaining within a certain key, But if you change the key, not only are you changing the mood and feel of it harmonically, you're also changing the chord progression. Two things that add to a huge shift the listener now feels, which could be completely great if that's what you're going for. But if you don't want that much of a change, looking for something more subtle, I'd say maybe don't change the key of the song. So the last technique I want to talk to you guys about before we get into listening to a couple of examples is the time signature. Out of all the strategies I mentioned, I'd say that changing the time signature within a piece of music is definitely the most effective, but also the least common. I'll explain why. The time signature is more related to the rhythm and tempo of a piece of music. The tempo and rhythm is a part of the music that's usually established early on and remains constant most of the time throughout. Whether they realize it or not, when the rhythm and feel remains constant throughout a piece of music, the listener gets used to where beats 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. are. The time signature also gives information as to what this is, whether a song has 4 beats in it and what value note gets each of those beats. A quarter note, an eighth note, a half note. The two things that make up the time signature are how many beats there are in a measure and what value note gets each of those beats. Just changing even one of those factors completely changes the flow that the listener is used to hearing throughout the piece. Depending on how many beats there are in a measure or what value note gets each of those beats in a different section, if you do change the time signature, it can give the illusion of maybe speeding up a piece or slowing it down or having to reorient where exactly beat 1 is. This is also, I'd say, the technique out of all the ones mentioned that creates a loss of predictability within a music and potentially, if gotten out of hand, makes a piece of music less accessible to a general audience. But if you're a music theory nerd like me, if done tastefully, time signature changes are actually pretty cool. At least I think so. If done right, as so much so not to create too much of a distraction from the different sections of the song, it can actually make a piece of music a bit more engaging and entertaining for the listener. But out of all the techniques mentioned, I'd say this is also the one that takes the most practice in getting used to being able to do well. So for right now, if you want to start off with messing with the time signature of a piece of music to get to a different section, I recommend doing it if you really want to get the effect of catching your listener off guard or keeping them interested or on the edge of the seat, waiting to see what happens next within the piece of music you wrote. As you probably guessed, on a scale of 1 to 5, I give this one a 1. It's not super commonly used in a large variety of genres of music. However, certain types of music like math rock and prog rock, well, they actually rely on the change of time signature to make the genre what it is. I have a few pieces of music in the works right now that have some time signature changes in it. Comment down below what you guys think about time signature changes within music. If you think they're really cool or kind of make you distracted from the music and you don't like it as much. Alright, so now we've reached the portion of the video where I want to look at one of my original pieces of music that I made and show you some examples of a few of the techniques that I've talked about today. The piece of music that we're going to be listening to today is an original of mine called Berry. I came out with it a couple months ago and I'll leave a link to it in the description if you want to see the music video for it. The first technique that we talked about that I'm going to show you an example of in this piece of music is how the melody is going to shift from being played from one instrument to another instrument. Let's give it a listen. So as you heard, the first time the melody was introduced, the piano was playing it. The piano, of course, has its own type of texture and timbre in and of itself. Now, the second time you hear the melody, as the music ramps up a little bit, I had the melody played by the trumpet and trombone, two brass instruments that have a completely different feel, even though they're playing the exact same melody line. The next technique that I already talked about that I'm going to show you an example of in my piece of music is changing chord progression from section to section. I'll play you those two sections I want to show you now, and I'm going to add little notations in the video so you can see exactly what chords I use from going from one section to the other. Let's listen to it now. So as you heard from each section, I just had a simple vamp from one chord to the other. I just changed one of them when you got to the next section of the song. It didn't have as much of an impact as it would if I changed the entire key of the song, but it was enough to where you can notice a texture difference in the harmony, so you knew you were in a different section of the song. This method was actually also combined with changing the melody. Something I forgot to mention earlier in the video, you can combine two techniques into one to shift between section to section. Okay, so the last of the techniques that we talked about that I want to show you an example of in my song is changing the rhythmic feel. Eighth notes and a snare hit on beats 2 and 4 are mainly what's driving the rhythm of this piece. That is until we get to after the bridge or solo section of it. During the solo section or bridge of the piece, I'm playing eighth notes on the ride and the hi-hat, and the snare hits on beats 2 and 4. However, coming out of the bridge into the final chorus of the piece, you can call it, I changed into what's called a halftime feel. The tempo of this song hasn't changed at all, but it kind of feels like it because I've changed where the hits of each of the pieces of the drum set are. Instead of eighth notes, I'm now playing quarter notes on the ride, and my main snare hits are now on beat 3 of each measure instead of on beats 2 and 4. Let's go ahead and give it a listen now, and you can see what I mean. Pretty cool, huh? Now, if you were to reverse this method, going from a halftime feel to a regular time feel, what that would then be called is going to double time, because what you initially heard wouldn't necessarily be called halftime, since that's what the listener was used to listening to for the entire piece of music. So I hope you guys liked that video on the different techniques I like to use from writing different sections of my pieces, and ones that I've noticed in a lot of the music that I listen to myself. Once again, I'm going to leave a link in the description for that original of mine that I made a music video for if you guys would like to see that. Now, if you found this video helpful and made you inspired to start using some of these techniques to write some music, I would definitely appreciate it if you liked this video. It helps it to get pushed out to more people who could also get ideas from this. So once again, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care and have a great time composing. See ya.